This episode was suggested by a listener, Ross, on Facebook. If you'd like to make a suggestion or ask a question, you can contact us on Facebook at Facebook/Morbid Curiosity Podcast, on Twitter at Morbid Podcast, and on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. The Morbid Curiosity Podcast is sponsored by Audible.com. Just for MCP listeners, you can get a free audiobook download, a 30-day free trial, and show your love for the MCP by going to www.audibletrial.com/MCP. There are over 180,000 titles to choose from, including a vast collection of horror fiction and morbid history for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or other MP3 player. I have some recommendations on the subject of today's episode, but I'll get to those later. For now, on with the episode. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. This interest in disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. Legend tells of a monk who broke his monastic vows and was sentenced to be walled up alive. In order to avoid this harsh penalty, he promised to create a gigantic manuscript which included all human knowledge to glorify his monastery forever. This he would do in a single night. Near midnight, he knew he would fail to complete this task alone, so he began to pray, not to God, but to the fallen angel Lucifer. He asked for help in finishing the book, and in exchange he would give the devil his soul. The devil appeared and completed the manuscript. The monk then added an illustration of the devil out of gratitude for his aid. This legend is ascribed to a real artifact, a huge Bible called the Codex Gigas. The Codex Gigas, which in Latin means giant book, is the largest surviving medieval manuscript in the world. It's also called the Devil's Bible, due to the large illustration of the devil on the inside, and the legend surrounding the manuscript's creation. It's thought that it was created in the early 12th century in the Benedictine monastery of Podlajica in Bohemia, what is now the Czech Republic. The end of the 12th and 13th century in the Czech lands was a period of revolutionary change and a new era for the landscape and society. Owners of land or property became nobility, and divided further into higher and lower nobility. The upper tier consisted of members of the Catholic Church, the laity, and the higher nobles. Together with the king, this small group administered the state, defended the land against enemies, spread the Christian faith, and governed the lives of the rest of the country. The largest component of the population was, of course, working people, made up of farmers and urban residents. They paid taxes to provide a higher standard of living for the other two tiers. This socio-economic situation has perpetuated throughout history, despite the fact that the working people were always in the majority, and could have swayed their overlords to see reason if they had banded together. In this social atmosphere, the Order of St. Benedict blossomed. It was made up of several independent monastic communities, groups of people living together under religious vows. Each community within the order maintained its independence, while the order itself represented the community's mutual interests. The Benedictine monks made several vows: a promise of stability, remaining in the same community, obedience to the community's superior, and conversatio morum. a great deal of research has been dedicated to the translation and interpretation of Conversatio Morum. An older translation is conversion of life, and has generally been replaced with phrases such as conversion to a monastic manner of life. Some scholars have suggested that the phrase is best translated as to live in this place as a monk in obedience to its rule and abbot. Benedictine leaders were called abbots and abbesses and had full jurisdiction of their abbey or monastery, and thus absolute authority over the monks or nuns who lived there. This authority included the power to assign duties, to decide which books may or may not be read, the regulating of comings and goings, and punishing those who broke their vows. A strict communal timetable, the horarium, was meant to ensure that time, which was believed to be given by God, was not wasted, but used in God's service, whether for prayer, work, meals, spiritual reading, or sleep. Some of this time was used to create manuscripts. The culture of manuscript creation also appears to have begun around the 10th century. That doesn't mean that manuscripts and recording information was not common before the 10th century, but during this time, historians have noted a greater influx and heavier importance placed on these manuscripts. The 10th century was a time when medical practitioners were increasing their understanding of human anatomy and how certain substances interacted with the body. They recorded this information in order to pass it on. During this time, monasteries and cathedrals were the centers of learning, so it made sense that these texts were being created there or ended up in the hands of the monks. Many of the monks meticulously recorded information from other texts, and in some cases improved upon them. In the case of herbals, books about plants and their medical uses, there is evidence that monks customized the information to be more relevant to the area in which they lived, and restricted themselves to only include practical information. In the case of bestiaries, on the other hand, books containing information on animals, monks generally copied and cited previous texts to pass them on. The consequence of taking bestiaries at face value was that the writers were free to elaborate and embellish, usually in an attempt to give the animal in question a certain moral or allegorical meaning beyond its physical appearance. Many of these manuscripts were copies of the Bible or other ecclesiastical texts, and this is true for the majority of the Codex Gigas. Before I go into details on what is contained in the manuscript, I want to tell you more about its physical appearance. The Codex Gigas earned its name due to its enormous size, being 35 by 19 inches, or 89 by 49 centimeters. It contains around 300 parchment and calfskin leaves and 2 paper end leaves. It weighs around 165 pounds, about as much as a tall human. The Codex is one of several other volumes known as giant Bibles. However, not only the Christian Bible was made in this large format. There are also some late medieval copies of the Quran that feature similarly impressive dimensions. One possible explanation as to why these books were made so big is that size tends to reflect importance. Because they contained the Word of God, it's possible that the bookmakers wished to reflect that importance in the text. It has also been suggested that these books were meant to highlight the power and prestige of the donors who paid for their creation. It's also possible that these manuscripts were made to rest on large lecterns for public reading, and their large size aided collective readers who had to stand far back from the book. Each page of the Codex is arranged into 2 columns, with 106 lines of text in each column. These pages are numbered, but the numbers were added long after the manuscript was originally penned. The Codex is bound in leather-covered wood. The leather cover has been rebound at least once since its creation, most likely due to a split in the cover, but the wood remains original. There are metal pieces on the corners of the cover, which have also been replaced at least once. The book contains several texts, including the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, Antiquities and the Jewish War by Flavius Josephus, a 1st century Romano-Jewish scholar, historian, and biographer of saints, and a copy of the Encyclopedia of the Middle Ages by Saint Isidore of Sevilla, a scholar and Archbishop of Sevilla for over 3 decades. Fun fact, Saint Isidore, more than a millennium after he died, is currently regarded as the patron saint of the Internet. Also included in the Codex is the standard textbook for teaching medicine in the Middle Ages, known as the Ars Medicinae, the art of medicine, and finally the New Testament. The Bible parts of the manuscript are the Vulgate version, a late 4th century translation, except the books of the Apostles and Revelations, which are from an earlier version of the Bible, the Vetus Latina, which is a Latin translation produced by Jerome. Also included in the Codex is a Chronicle of Bohemia, the first history of Bohemia on record, by the author Cosmas of Prague, a priest, writer, and historian born in a noble family of Bohemia. The rest of the Codex contains several short essays on topics such as penitence, the exorcising of demons, and a calendar that commemorates saints and famous Bohemians. At one point, a guide to monastic life called the Rule of St. Benedict was part of the Codex, but it was later cut out, and the reason why is unknown. There are illustrations throughout the Codex, including a portrait of the writer Flavius Josephus, circular drawings of heaven and earth, and the first letter of each Bible book and the Chronicle of Bohemia are elaborately sketched with vines and some small animals. The fact that the first letter of the Chronicle is also illustrated this way indicates pride in the history of Bohemia. There are only 2 full-page illustrations in the book, one of heavenly Jerusalem, and on the page opposite, the famous illustration of the devil. These 2 images are framed similarly, and likely represent heaven and hell. The text of the Codex is written in Carolingian minuscule, a type of medieval script that was popular between the 9th and 12th century. Medieval scribes could write roughly 100 lines a day, giving an estimated writing time of 10 to 20 years for the whole manuscript, with 5 years dedicated to the text alone. It appears that a single person wrote and inscribed the entire Codex. Their style is unique and very distinctive, yet no practice pages have ever been found, which is mysterious by itself. This single writer theory, in addition to the illustration of the devil, adds to the manuscript's mythos, as it appears to support the legend of a man selling his soul to the devil to help him complete it. In fact, this legend has apparently existed since the medieval age itself, which is odd, as at the time, intense expressions of piety, such as walling oneself up in the walls of a church, were more commonplace. A monk dedicating his entire life to creating a manuscript is not too far out of the ordinary in that context. However, the book was unique from its beginnings, so many stories grew up around it. Another of these is that it was written on the hides of over 100 donkeys, and that satanic images are scattered throughout. These stories are just that, sensationalized stories. Even the demonic imagery and the section on exorcism was not unusual for these types of manuscripts. Speaking of demonic imagery, the illustration of the devil on page 577 is not the red-skinned, horned devil imagery we are used to in the modern age. The devil in the Codex is bluish-green, with large red and yellow talons on his fingers and toes. In the image he appears to be jumping, with his knees drawn up near his chest. The image is quite colorful, and of course, as it is a giant-sized illustration of the devil, has drawn curiosity and sensationalism since its creation. As I said before, directly opposite the devil is a full-page depiction of the kingdom of heaven, both illustrations together representing good and evil, or heaven and hell. Several of the pages before these illustrations are written on blackened parchment and look somewhat different from the rest of the codex. The reason for this variation in coloring is that these pages of the codex are made of vellum. Vellum, or scraped dried animal hide, darkens when exposed to ultraviolet light. Over the centuries, these pages, which were turned to most frequently, have tanned to a darker color. The life of the codex is just as interesting as the object itself. Evidence of its origin exists within the manuscript in the form of a note on the first leaf of the codex that names the Bohemian Benedictine monastery at Podlajica as the manuscript's first known owner. It's unlikely that the codex was written at Podlajica. The monastery was too small and too poor to undertake such an advanced enterprise, one that required enormous human and material resources. To our knowledge, no other medieval manuscript was created at this monastery. The Benedictines of Podlajica later had to sell the manuscript to the Cistercians of Sedlec for financial reasons. The note on the first leaf also records that in 1295 the codex was bought back for the Benedictines by Bayer, abbot of the Brevnov monastery, at the insistence of Bishop Gregory of Prague, who was bishop from 1296 to 1301. The manuscript, even then, was considered as one of the wonders of the world. It's unclear whether this purchase actually took place in 1295, as Gregory was elected bishop in 1296. It's possible the scribe mistakenly entered 1295 instead of 1296. The author of the Codex Gigas is unknown, but the name Hermanus Monachus Inclusus, or Herman the Recluse or the Confined, appears on the 10th of November in the necrology or obituary section. The epithet Inclusus is linked with the legend of the walled-up, sinful monk creating the Codex Gigas in a single night with the assistance of the devil. However, the term inclusus or reclusus actually denotes a recluse, a person usually affiliated with a monastery that lives in isolation in a cell for religious or ascetic reasons. Rarely it was a form of penitence. Usually, after a 1-year trial period, the person would be locked in a cell by a bishop, who would then affix his seal to the cell door. Sometimes the cell would be walled up and a requiem mass sung for the reclusus, symbolizing a funeral. Both women and men participated in this, and were sometimes referred to as anchorites. This way of life was more common under the Benedictines and Cistercians, and therefore the designation reclusus was not uncommon in medieval necrologies. Another theory as to the name of the scribe of the Codex is Sobislaus. This name appears in a prayer to the Virgin Mary, added in the margin of page 273. However, this prayer is written in a different hand from the rest of the manuscript, and it was added later in the 13th century. With the outbreak of the Hussite War in 1420, the monks of Brevnov evacuated their monastery and moved to a daughter community at Brumov. There the manuscript was seen by a certain M. Johannes Fraunberg of Görlitz in 1477. We know this thanks to a letter he wrote that briefly describes the manuscript. The Codex Gigas served as a kind of guest book during the 16th century, with various churchmen from Prague and neighboring Silesia entering their names in the manuscript when they visited the Bromov monastery. One of the names in the codex was Christopher Schlichtig, a supporter of the Swiss mystic, alchemist, and physician Paracelsus. Schlichtig stayed at the monastery on the 26th of September, 1590, and the entry refers to him as a iatrochemical philosopher, a school of thought that sought to understand medicine and physiology in terms of chemistry, and the physician in ordinary to Prince William V of Bavaria. Rudolph II, King of Bohemia and Holy Roman Emperor between 1576 and 1612, was interested in the Devil's Bible and wanted to borrow it and take it with him back to Prague. Rudolph, a great bibliophile, was known for his interest in the occult. With the manuscript still regarded as the property of the Brevnov monastery, permission was given for the loan in one of the entries of the Codex. It left Bronov for Prague on the 4th of March, 1594. A note records that the Codex spent the night of the 6th of March at Nachod and the 16th of March at Nienburg. Nienburg is only 50 kilometers from Prague, so the manuscript must have reached its final destination soon afterwards. Despite the manuscript being just a loan, it never made it back to Bromov. This was not the only monastic property that Rudolf II borrowed and never returned. In 1649, the Codex Gigas arrived at the castle in Stockholm, Sweden, with many other books and manuscripts that had been captured in Prague during the 30 Years' War, a series of armed conflicts between 1618 and 1648 between Protestants and Catholics. In 1697, a fire broke out in the castle, and the Codex Gigas was saved by being thrown out a window. It is said that someone standing beneath the window was injured when the book fell on them. This is likely false, but the manuscript's binding was damaged by the fall, causing several pages to be knocked loose. Those pages are still missing today. The Codex Gigas' fame was far from burning out, however. More names were inscribed in it by visitors to the Royal Library, what is now the Swedish National Library, where the manuscript is still housed. The Codex has since been studied by historians, librarians, and theologians, and has also been digitized in its entirety. You can find free versions of the Codex on Amazon.com if you're interested in seeing its pages for yourself. The original manuscript, however, is no longer on display for the general public. In September 2007, after 359 years, the Codex Gigas returned to Prague on loan from Sweden until January 2008. It was displayed at the Czech National Library. Like so many other famous objects with airs of mystery, a large amount of media has been dedicated to the Codex Gigas, most of which are television documentaries. Most of these are incredibly dramatized, and I couldn't actually find one that wasn't, so for once I have no recommendations. If you know of a historical documentary on the Codex Gigas, please share it on our Facebook page at Facebook/Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you're interested in reading more about the Codex and its history, I recommend visiting the National Library of Sweden's website. Just Google National Library of Sweden and Codex Gigas, and you'll find it right away. It was one of few sources that gave a lot of historical documentation without focusing too much on the legend of the Codex creation. If you're interested in learning more about medieval manuscript creation or the medieval period in general, I do have recommendations. One is the medieval manuscript book, Cultural Approaches, edited by M. Johnson and M. Van Dusen. This is a textbook and has a wealth of information on the history and cultural significance of manuscripts like the Codex Gigas. If you'd like to know more about the medieval age in Europe, the historical context of the Codex Gigas, I'd recommend The History of the Medieval World, From the Conversion of Constantine to the First Crusade by Susan Wise Bauer. If you're interested in anchorites and recluses, the people who walled themselves into churches and monasteries, there's a novel I really enjoyed called Illuminations, a novel of Hildegard von Bingen, by Mary Sherratt. I wouldn't normally recommend fiction on this podcast, but this book was well researched and really enjoyable. Perhaps I'll do a whole episode on anchorites in the future as well, as it's a fascinating topic. As I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, just for MCP listeners, Audible.com is offering a free audiobook download and a 30-day trial. You can download The History of the Medieval World and Illuminations or any other audiobook for free by going to www.audibletrial.com/MCP. Once again, that's www.audibletrial.com/MCP. Legends have the power to live long lives, especially when they surround an object with equal longevity and more than an ounce of mystery. It is often forgotten, or sometimes even omitted, that the image of the devil in the Codex Gigas is part of a set, a set that shows both heaven and hell. This pairing was common in ecclesiastical manuscripts from the medieval era. Even so, the Codex Gigas, with its extreme size, exciting life story, it lived through peace, war, fire, and a long fall, and the fact that the author is still unknown and has no other known works, keeps its legend alive, no matter how embellished it becomes. And that is why it brings out the curiosity in us. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can tweet the show at Morbid Podcast or find us on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media and give us a rating on iTunes. Your shares and ratings help us grow our creepy community. Speaking of our creepy community, the MCP is part of the Belfry Podcast Network. Check out the other shows on the Belfry Network at www.thebelfry.rip. If you'd like to support the MCP, you can go to our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. There you'll find a donation button, links to all our social media, and other ways to contact us. Your donations help us keep the podcast going. We really appreciate your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thank you for listening.